At 80, I look at old photographs and see a woman I never let myself be, and that is my greatest regret. There is a photograph of me taken in the summer of 1968 that I keep in a drawer rather than on a shelf. And I want to tell you why, because the why is the whole of what I have been trying to understand for the last 15 years. My name is Carolyn. I'm 80 years old, and in that photograph, I am 24 years old and standing on the steps of a building in Boston where I had just been accepted into an architecture program. And I am smiling in a way that I have not smiled in any photograph taken since. A smile that is not performed for the camera, but that is simply the outward expression of something real and enormous happening on the inside. And I did not go to that program. And the woman in that photograph is someone I have been grieving, quietly and without much acknowledgment, for most of my adult life. I want to tell you the whole story, because the whole story is the only version that does justice to the complexity of what I am trying to describe. And because the partial version, the version that is simply about a woman who gave up her dreams for a conventional life, is not accurate enough to be useful. The truth is more complicated than that, and more honest, and more relevant to the lives that most people are actually living, which are lives shaped not by dramatic choices, but by the accumulation of small ones, by the gradual and mostly invisible process by which a person learns to want less than they originally wanted, and learns to call the wanting less by names that sound like wisdom rather than names that sound like loss. I grew up in a suburb of Philadelphia in the 1950s and 1960s, the second of 3 daughters, in a family that was comfortable and loving and organized around a set of assumptions about what women were for that were so thoroughly embedded in the texture of daily life that they did not present themselves as assumptions at all, but simply as the way things were, as natural and unremarkable as the weather. My father was an engineer, a good one, who found genuine satisfaction in the problem-solving of his work and who spoke about it at the dinner table with an enthusiasm that I found, from a very young age, more compelling than almost anything else I encountered. My mother managed the household and raised 3 daughters and was, by every measure her world had available, a success at both, and she was also, I understand now, in a way I could not have understood then, a woman who had wanted things she had not pursued and who had made a separate peace with the wanting that was genuine, and that cost her things she had chosen not to examine. I wanted to build things, not in the vague sense that children want to be things when they grow up, before the wanting has been tested against reality and refined by the understanding of what the wanting actually requires. In the specific sense, I was the child who drew floor plans in the margins of notebooks, who could not enter a building without trying to understand how it was organized and why, who spent weekend afternoons at 15 walking through the city, looking at the way buildings met the street and the sky and each other, feeling something in that looking that I did not have a name for yet, and that I understand now was the feeling of encountering the thing you are for. I wanted to be an architect with the same quality of certainty that my father brought to his engineering, the clarity of a person who is not performing a vocation, but simply doing the thing that is continuous with who they fundamentally are. I was good at mathematics, and good at drawing, and good at the spatial reasoning that architecture requires. And my high school teachers, the ones who paid attention, noted these abilities with a consistency that should have been, and was, encouraging to the part of me that was trying to figure out what to do with them. I applied to architecture programs at 3 universities and was accepted at all 3, and the acceptance at the Boston program, which was then and remains one of the most respected in the country, produced the feeling that was on my face in the photograph in the drawer, the feeling of a door opening onto a room you had always believed existed and had never quite been sure you would be permitted to enter. And then I did not go. I want to describe how that happened with the precision it deserves, because I think the how is the most important part of the story for the people who most need to hear it, which are the people who are in the middle of their own version of it and who may not yet be able to see it clearly enough to recognize what is happening. I did not have my opportunity taken from me. I want to say that clearly, because the version of this story that places all the agency outside the woman is not my story, and I suspect it is not the story of most women who have lived something like what I lived. And the comfort it offers is a false comfort, because it does not locate the truth accurately enough to be useful. What happened was that I was offered, alongside the acceptance at the architecture program, a set of pressures that were real, and a set of messages that were consistent, and a set of choices that were shaped by a world that had opinions about what women should want, and that expressed those opinions in ways that did not always announce themselves as pressure, but that functioned as pressure nonetheless. My father, who was himself an engineer, and who respected the intelligence behind my wanting to study architecture, nonetheless expressed, over the spring and summer of 1968, a series of quiet reservations that were framed as practical concerns, and that were experienced by me as something closer to doubt, as the message, delivered without cruelty, and probably without full awareness of what was being delivered, that the wanting was perhaps more than the world was going to cooperate with. He talked about the difficulty of the field for women, which was real. The numbers in architecture programs and in professional practice were not encouraging, and the talking about it, which he intended as preparation for a genuine challenge, functioned instead as a preemptive assessment of my prospects that I was not yet equipped to set aside. He talked about the distance from home, as if distance were a complication rather than an adventure, which was how I experienced it, but which was not how the conversation framed it. He talked, gently and without malice, about the various ways the path I was proposing was going to be harder than I might currently appreciate. And what I heard in all of that talking, though I do not believe it was what he intended me to hear, was that he was not sure I was going to be able to do it. My mother said less, which was in some ways more damaging, because what she didn't say carried the weight of everything she had not pursued herself, and the weight of that was considerable. She supported me, she said, in whatever I decided, which was loving and true, and which also communicated, in the way that parents communicate things without meaning to, that the decision was open in a way that I had not previously understood it to be open. That going was a choice that required justification rather than the obvious next step in the direction I had been moving for years. There was also a man. There is almost always a man in this version of the story, and I want to be honest about his role, because dishonesty about it would be a different kind of distortion. His name was Richard, and we had been together for a year and a half by the spring of 1968, and he was kind and intelligent and genuinely fond of me. And also, when the conversation about Boston came, quietly but consistently in favor of alternatives that did not involve my moving to Massachusetts for 5 years. He did not ask me not to go. He would not have asked me not to go. But he communicated, in the accumulated weight of 100 small conversations across that spring and summer, that he hoped I wouldn't. And the hoping, combined with everything else that was pressing on the decision, became part of the atmosphere in which I made it. I enrolled instead in a 2-year program in interior design at a school in Philadelphia, which was close to home and practical, and suited to a young woman who had interests in the built environment and who wanted something professional, but not in the way that architecture was professional, not in the way that required the full and determined pursuit of something in a field that was going to resist the pursuing. Interior design was, in the framing of 1968, the appropriate feminine adjacent to architecture, the version of the wanting that fit the available space. And I enrolled in it, and I was good at it, and I told myself and everyone around me that it was what I had wanted, or close enough to what I had wanted, that the difference did not require acknowledgment. I graduated, married Richard in 1971, had 2 children, a daughter named Anne in 1973, and a son named Thomas in 1976, and built a life that was genuinely good in the ways that a life can be genuinely good, and also constructed around a suppression that I maintained with such consistency for so long that I eventually became, for extended periods, unable to feel it as suppression. That is the thing about the gradual accommodation to a smaller version of yourself. It does not feel like reduction. It feels like maturity, like the reasonable adjustment of early idealism to the actual conditions of an actual life. And the feeling is so widely shared and so consistently validated by the culture around you that the doubt, when it comes, can seem like ingratitude rather than accuracy. I worked as an interior designer for 20 years, part-time when the children were young, and more fully after they were in school. And I was good at it in a way that was satisfying, and that was also, always and underneath, not the thing. The thing was buildings. The thing was structures. The relationship between a building and the people who moved through it. The way space could be organized to produce experiences that the people having them could not always identify, but that were real and that architecture was responsible for. Interior design touched the edges of that. It was adjacent to it. And being adjacent to the thing for 20 years, while being good at the adjacency, and being thanked for the adjacency, and being told that the adjacency was a valuable and legitimate profession, which it is, produced a particular quality of dissatisfaction that was hard to name because it was not dissatisfaction with what I had, but with what I had instead, which is a different kind of dissatisfaction, and one that is harder to address because the addressing of it requires acknowledging the instead. Richard and I were married for 31 years, until his death from cancer in 2002, which came after a 2-year illness that I accompanied with the full investment of someone who understood, by then, that a shared life is not a compromise, but a genuine thing with its own value, and that the grief of losing it is real regardless of whatever else is true about the life. I loved Richard. I want to say that clearly because the story I am telling could be mistaken for a story about a marriage that was the wrong life, and it was not the wrong life. It was my life, built by my choices in the circumstances I was in, and it contained real love and real satisfaction and real meaning, and also the specific and persistent absence of the thing I had wanted at 24. After Richard died, I had a period of about 2 years. That was the standard difficult period of grief and adjustment and the reconfiguration of a daily life that had been built around 2 people and was now being rebuilt around 1. And during that period, the question of the thing I had not done and not become receded, as it had always receded when there was something immediate and demanding requiring my attention. And then the period ended, the way those periods end, not all at once, but gradually, with the return of appetite and engagement, and the ordinary forward movement of a life that has not finished. And in the quiet that followed the return, I found the question waiting for me, patient and unresolved, and no longer willing to be deferred. I was 63 years old when I first went back to look at architecture seriously, not as a fantasy of what might have been, but as an actual subject that I engaged with as an educated adult who had been adjacent to it for 30 years, and who now had the time and the permission being the most significant new element, to pursue it without the constraints that had shaped the original decision. I took a course at a local university, just one course in architectural history, and I sat in that classroom for the first time in 40 years as a student of the actual subject rather than its adjacent. And I felt something that I am going to describe as accurately as I can, which is that it felt like returning to myself after a very long time away, like finding a room in your own house that you had forgotten existed, and discovering that everything you had left there was still there, undisturbed, waiting. I took more courses. I did not become an architect. I want to be clear about that, because at 63 with a 2-year illness recently behind me and a life to reconstruct the 5-year professional program was not the practical path, and I was honest with myself about that. In a way, I had not always been honest with myself about things. But I engaged with the subject fully and seriously, and I began, in the engaging, to understand something about the 30 years I had spent in the adjacency that I had not understood while I was in it. What I understood was that the decision I made in 1968 was not a single decision, but a series of decisions, made over months and years and decades, each one a small accommodation to the version of myself that the world around me found most manageable, and that what I had understood as a single moment of choosing had actually been a long process of being shaped, of having the edges of my wanting worn down by the consistent pressure of other people's comfort with the smaller version of me, and my own gradually acquired comfort with their comfort. I did not go to Boston because I was afraid, and the fear was real, and the things that generated the fear were real. My father's reservations and my mother's silence, and Richard's hoping and the genuine difficulty of the field for women in 1968 were all real conditions and not nothing. But they were also not insurmountable, and I had, at 24, the capability and the determination that surmounting them would have required. And what I had not had was the sufficient belief in my own assessment of what I was for, to set against the accumulated weight of other people's doubt. I did not believe enough in my own knowing. That is the most accurate thing I can say about what happened in 1968. I knew what I was for. The photograph is the evidence of the knowing. The smile on the steps is the smile of a woman who knows, who has just received external confirmation of something she has known internally for years. And what came next was the slow erosion of that knowing by a world that had reasons, some of them genuine and some of them simply convenient, to prefer a smaller version of what I was capable of. Anne, my daughter, is 50 years old, and she is an architect. I want to say that and let it sit for a moment, because it is a fact that contains several things simultaneously, things that are not in contradiction, but that are in tension, and that I have had to learn to hold in tension, rather than resolving them into something simpler. She is an architect because she wanted to be an architect, and because she pursued it with the full determination of a woman of her generation who had been raised by a mother who, whatever else she did or did not do, made it clear that the pursuing was not only possible but expected. She asked me once, when she was in her 30s and well established in her practice, whether I ever regretted not becoming an architect myself. She asked it with the directness that I had always tried to encourage in her, and I told her the truth, which was yes, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mom, why didn't you?" And I told her, as honestly as I could, the version of the story I have told you today, and she listened with an expression that moved through several things I recognized, understanding and grief, and something that looked like a reckoning of her own. And at the end she said, "I think I always knew. I think that's part of why I became one. I have thought about that often. The way our unlived lives shape the lives of our children, not as absence, but as transmission, as a message sent through the texture of how we live and what we value and what we make room for in the house we create for them. A message that they receive and interpret in their own way, and that sometimes produces in the next generation the thing that was suppressed in the one before it, and became what I did not become, and there is a grief in that, and a beauty in it, and I have learned to hold both without needing to resolve the holding. The photographs are the hardest thing. I have a box of them, the kind of box that every family has somewhere in the back of a closet, full of the visual record of a life in its various configurations. And when I go through that box, the photographs I stop longest at are not the ones that show what I had, though what I had was real, and the having of it was genuine, but the ones that show the version of myself that existed before the accommodation, the young woman in the year or two before Boston, who was, in the photographs, completely and uncomplicatedly herself, who had not yet learned to manage herself into a size that fit the available space. She is someone I recognize. That is the most precise way I can say it. She is someone I recognize as myself, in a way that the woman in the photographs from the years that followed is someone I recognize as the version of myself I constructed, and the difference between those two kinds of recognition is the difference I am trying to describe. You can recognize yourself in the person you became, but the person you were before you learned to become someone the world found manageable, that recognition has a different quality, a quality of encountering something essential that the subsequent years of construction and accommodation have covered but not eliminated. I am 80 years old, and I am, in the time I have, trying to uncover it, not to recover what is irrecoverable, because I am honest enough at 80 to understand that the life I did not live is not available to me now, and that the grief for it, while real, is not a productive place to live. But to be, in the conversations I have and the work I do, and the things I allow myself to want, without immediately checking them against what is appropriate or practical or fitting, more fully the person I recognize in the early photographs than the person I recognize in the later ones. I volunteer twice a week at a nonprofit that helps young people in underserved communities access design education, and I teach drawing and spatial reasoning and the basic principles of architectural thinking to 12 and 13-year-olds who have never had occasion to consider that the buildings they move through every day were designed by someone, that the spaces they inhabit are the result of choices, and that the making of those choices is a profession that is available to them. I teach it with the full investment of someone who's doing the actual thing, not the adjacent thing, for the first time, and the children in those rooms receive what I am teaching with the openness that children have before the world has taught them to manage their wanting, before they have learned to want in the size that fits the available space. I look at them, and I see the woman in the photograph, not in any sentimental sense, not in the sense that they are me, or that my story is theirs. In the sense that they are still in possession of something that a life can remove if you are not sufficiently careful about protecting it, which is the unedited knowing of what they are for, the certainty before the doubt arrives, the smile before the accommodation begins, and I teach them, alongside the drawing and the geometry and the principles of structure and light, the thing I most wish someone had taught me at their age, which is that the knowing is worth protecting, that the world will have opinions about what size your wanting should be, and that those opinions, however they are delivered and by whomever they are held, are not the final word on the subject. You are the final word on the subject. That is what I would tell the woman in the photograph, if I could tell her anything. Not that the path would be easy, because it would not have been easy, and the difficulty of it was real, and I was right to take it seriously. But that the knowing on her face in that moment, the knowing that produced that particular smile on those particular steps on that particular afternoon in Boston in 1968, was accurate, and that the accuracy of it was worth defending against everything that was about to be brought to bear against it, and that the defending, however hard, was worth everything it would have cost. I keep the photograph in the drawer because looking at it is still difficult, which tells me that the grief is still real and that the grief is still honest. An honest grief seems to me, at 80, more valuable than a comfort that requires me to be less than truthful about what was lost. But I take it out sometimes. I take it out and I look at her, the woman on the steps, and I say to her the things I am still learning to say to myself, which is that she was right about what she knew, that the knowing was real, that it is not too late for the part of the knowing that is still available, and that the part that is not still available is not nothing even now, because it lives in the room where I teach 12-year-olds to understand space and light and the relationship between a building and the people who move through it, and in my daughter's practice, and in everything I built, however belatedly and incompletely, from the material of what I had always known and had taken too long to fully trust. She is still in there, the woman in the photograph. I am still in there. And at 80, with whatever time remains, I am done keeping her in the drawer.